Imagine you started writing a data validation library in 2017. It's just for yourself because you felt it was missing from Python. But a few things go your way. Firstly, there's a big movement in programming in general back towards types. And secondly, in 2020, OpenAI released GPT-3. And gradually, and then suddenly, every company in the world needs to validate unknown data coming back from an API. Your library is used by Facebook, Google, Anthropic, OpenAI, even the NSA. It's one of the most popular libraries in the world. So how do you build a startup off this? You could launch a hosted version, you could add premium features like Tailwind do, or you could rip up the playbook entirely. This is an interview with Samuel Colvin, the creator of Pydantic. Last month, Samuel announced that he'd raised $12.5 million from Sequoia to build something that has very little to do with data validation. He's building Logfire, an observability tool, and his reasons are very interesting.
At the risk of getting kind of philosophical and looking into the camera, there's been a progressive change in software over the last 30 years. So 90s, everything was strictly typed. We had SQL databases and we had C++ and Java. And then everyone discovered that they really wanted the Rails taking off and having everything was relaxed and you could do it however you wanted. And we had Python and we had JavaScript. We had no type hints. We had NoSQL databases where you could just lob anything into the database and it would always work. And then there's been this slow progress back the other way almost since about 2012. We had TypeScript, type hints in Python. No one's building, or very few people are building with NoSQL databases now from scratch. People are back to wanting SQL. Turns out they want some version of those guardrails. And obviously they don't want it to look like it did in the 90s, but people want guardrails when they're building larger applications because this anything works runs into limitations when you don't have any warning that you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it does feel like I'm mostly familiar with JavaScript and then to some smaller extent Python, and it seems like there's just that broader movement towards that.
I think if you had said to everyone in 2008 that in 15 years time everyone was spending their time getting the static type checker to pass, people would have been very confused. They would have been we just got away from trying to get the compiler to work, and we can just write Python and JavaScript and it always just works.
Yeah,
but it turns out that is infuriating when just works covers up a whole bunch of data integrity issues or weird runtime exceptions or whatever it might be. And so turns out people want some version of that guardrails.
Yeah, that makes sense. This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. At some point, you're going to land a big customer and they're going to ask you for enterprise features. That's where WorkOS comes in because they give you these features out the box. Features like skim provisioning, SAML authentication, and audit logs. They have an easy-to-use API, and they're trusted by big dev tools like Vercel, as well as smaller, fast-growing dev tools like Knock. So if you're looking to cross the enterprise chasm and make yourself enterprise-ready, check out WorkOS. We've also done an episode with Michael, the founder of WorkOS, where he shares a lot of tips around crossing the enterprise chasm, landing your first enterprise deals, and making sure that you're ready for them. Thanks, WorkOS, for sponsoring the podcast, and back to the show. And so when you first started Pydantic, were you what were the first lines of code that you were writing? Was it just...
I was working on some project of my own and I wanted to be able to validate HTTP headers. And I had this weird situation where I would have code that did that validation and then I would have type hints and I had to manually keep the two in sync. And that seemed like such a weird thing. I found the fact that it is, if you step back and you stop thinking about if you don't think about the history of Python, where it's all come from, and you imagine being someone in your first week of writing code, and you get shown a data class in Python, and you get told, this is the correct way to do things, you should put these type hints in here, and that will make your application safer, because this clever program will be able to come along and detect certain sorts of error. And then you try using it, and you're like, by the way, you can pass any value you like to that thing that says integer next to it, and nothing will go wrong until you try using it. That is really weird. I mean, I understand why we are that way. I'm not saying that data classes should be automatically sort of type checked. I think one of the good things Python has done is not bring that into the language so that libraries like Pydantic can innovate more quickly. but it is kind of weird.
Yeah.
And that is the thing that kind of drives people, I think, to use Pydantic, is they use type hints within their program where everything is typed. It's really helpful. But you get to the boundaries of that, whether you're reading API request or a CSV file or HTTP headers or direct user input or stuff from a database or whatever it might be, and suddenly those type hints are useless. And Pydantic effectively, allows you to use them.
Did anything exist when you started, or was it just like some stuff existed, but it wasn't so great?
So there were libraries like Marshmallow and Django RESTful Framework and Cerberus and a bunch of other ones that did some form of data validation, yes, but none of them were using type hints because they all predated the type hint world.
Yeah.
So when I first started like playing around with can we use them, I thought I might have to do some horrid thing where I like read the raw Python file again to find the type hints. I didn't know about this kind of odd mistake when they were adding type hints to Python, that they had left annotations around at runtime in this done to annotations attribute. And I was like, oh, this is much easier than I thought it was going to be, and much less hacky than I thought it was going to be. And so released it and put it on Hacker News, and it got a lot more attention than most things I've ever put on Hacker News since, or most open source libraries I created back then. People immediately were compelled by, it's type hints.
Yeah.
But there was a sense of, well, Marshmallow is the incumbent. You'll never be able to do all the stuff that Marshmallow can do. And obviously, over time, I added that stuff. But it was definitely a slow progress. And I think I look now at lots of the people doing kind of open source for startup, as in, I'm going to build this open source library and then I'm going to try and raise money off it 3 months later. Some of them are very successful, but lots of them less so. And I feel like there's a big difference between a library like that grew organically for year after year before I needed it to be successful for commercial reasons.
What do you think are the biggest differences between?
I go back to downloads as a metric of success in no small part because it's the metric in which we're most successful. I also think it's the most meaningful one. In some ways, it's better. Like, sure, they're all vanity metrics. They're all to some extent to be questioned one way or another. But like, I think it's more meaningful than GitHub stars, for example.
Yeah. I agree.
But that happens because over years people adopt things. But also the breadth of usage and the knowledge that it definitely can be used in production.
Yeah.
That you don't get with a library that's 3 months old where no one's using it in production yet.
Yeah, it must be challenging if you're someone like LangChain that just like completely catches fire like immediately, and like you're trying to like you don't have that time to kind of.
I think that LangChain has been in some ways very successful, and that's great for them, and wish them all best of luck. But you can see how that has come with some challenges in terms of. Yeah, I think if it had 5 years to like rattle around in the open source ecosystem with people coming along and tweaking it here and there and improving it, it would probably be more robust now than if it, is almost a victim of its own success, in the sense that it, people were so desperate to do anything with an LLM that it took off so quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then I first came across Pydantic at the AI Engineers Summit.
Oh, yeah.
And Jason Liu did a talk called Pydantic is All You Need.
Yep.
And I'd somehow assumed that this was like really important because it just seemed to like suddenly everyone was talking about Pydantic in that little world that I was in. But I wondered if that was that like a kind of a noticeable thing? I
think not in terms of downloads directly, because the numbers were already like very large, and there were lots of large, those large organizations where they're building basically there are builds going on constantly, and there are presumably, if you're inside a company like OpenAI or Anthropic and you have a big monorepo, there are basically builds going on constantly 24/7, and every single one of them is downloading Pydantic. So I imagine those projects and inside banks and stuff are downloading it, multiple times a minute for, all the time. So I don't think I saw it in terms of downloads, but definitely in terms of the kind of zeitgeist of how to build things with LLMs. Yeah. Jason's support of Pydantic has been incredibly valuable in particularly in that there are lots of people building that stuff who are not steeped in the history of Python and how to go and do things, who might not find out about Pydantic if it wasn't for those who are known in AI and are talking about using it.
Yeah, and did that kind of come about completely organically?
Completely organically. I didn't,
Yeah.
I think I'd seen Jason on Twitter at that point, but I don't think I'd spoken to him at all. I think I reached out to him because I suddenly saw on Twitter this random, like, blacked out room, massive, like, message, Pydantic is all you need. I mean, you couldn't dream of that kind of marketing, right? At some like AI summit. So
Yeah, that's why I kind of almost like had to ask, because it's almost just like it's like literally like a talk where it's like a sales pitch for Pydantic, but he has completely unaffiliated.
Jason is successful enough that I definitely couldn't afford to get him to PR for us if I was having to pay him. So thankfully he just did it for us.
I think he also did another one, right? Pydantic is still all you need.
He's done a number. I mean, now he's a friend and I speak to him quite a lot, and he's given us advice on stuff. So now it's less like purely organic, but yeah.
That's very cool. Sorry. Once again, this is just water. So, okay, Pydantic, very, very successful. I think it's pretty much like, you've kind of hit that level where it's like, it's hard to find projects that are more successful in terms of open source projects.
In terms of downloads, definitely. And in terms of like adoption, in terms of the vanity metric of stars, we're nowhere, but like, that's fine. We're a building block and people know it, and that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe there's a quick aside. Like, why do you think stars is a vanity metric and downloads is?
Because stars is like, you can go and look at something and you can, oh, that looks nice, star. And then maybe you install it, it's useless. Or the documentation is lacking, or it just turns out not to be what you need. No one goes and unstars it. And so, look, I've built libraries like FastUI. I think it's a really exciting idea. I really want to work on it more. I haven't had time to go and finish it or write the documentation. It has 8,000 stars. Why? Because when you read the first paragraph of the README, it seems compelling. And people go, oh, that's cool, star. Then they recommend it to someone at work. Someone goes and tries to use it. It's like, it's crap. It has no documentation. It doesn't seem complete. And we use it, and it's great for our internal use. But that's because I built it, so I know how to use it. But like without, for example, documentation or finishing some of the edge cases, it's not much use. And I think that there are lots of other libraries out there which would fall into the same category.
So it's like it's got 8,000 stars. I think Pydantic has like 21,000.
Yeah.
It's not, almost 50% as complete as, yeah.
I mean, and it has, I don't know this, but some thousands of downloads a week.
Okay.
So
and Pydantic has, you said,
like whatever that comes out to be,
hundreds of millions.
Yeah, like 70 million a week, right? It's completely different, and there are other libraries that I maintain that it is just not a good correlation for whether or not things that people have found things useful.
Yeah,
I have this theory that to build a great open source library, it has to be understandable in 30 seconds what it does. It has to be useful in 3 minutes from when you start using it, and it has to not have pissed you off after 300 hours of using it. And the stars only really covers the first point. After 30 seconds, you get what it does and it seems compelling, you click star. To even after the 3 minutes of, it actually works and I find it useful, you can fail and still get the star. Let alone the like a year later of using it in my library, I actually still think it's a good library.
Yeah, that's a really good framework, actually. That should be you should write an essay on that.
I mean, I think it also applies to product, right? As in, like, it maybe it's different. Of course, things aren't always as easy to adopt as a library like that. But you should think about that. Like, it has to carry on being compelling all the way through.
Yeah.
And if you miss any of those 3 points, no one's going to use it. In effect, as in, if no one gets it when they look at the README, people are just going to like bounce off and go somewhere else. If when they start trying to use it, it's annoying or confusing, a lot of people will abandon it. There are lots of other options. We're not in a world of like, you have to use the Microsoft framework, and therefore if it takes you a week to understand it, that's just how it is. There's always another library. If it's annoying when you start using it, you'll abandon it. And if you get 2 months down the line and you're like, it just turns out that it crashes occasionally and we don't know why, you'll end up ripping it out because there'll be something else out there. And that's what's great about open source, right? It's a competitive market, even if it's a market of free things.
Yeah, this is I think this is a really good point, and probably like, especially I feel like if you're like an investor, it's like probably like something to really watch out for is like if someone's just hitting those like star metrics, but
Yeah.
no one's actually using it. I have a lot of people that ask me to like star their repos, and I always think it's like kind of like a ridiculous thing to ask.
Yeah.
Because it's like, what do you get from that? Like,
Well, and also 1 star doesn't get you very far, right?
Yeah.
As in, what does LangChain have? 70, 80,000 stars,
Yeah.
same as Fast API. If you want to be taken seriously on the star count, you're going to ask 80,000 people to star your repo? Obviously
yeah,
not.
it's better to focus on like really hitting a compelling case
Yeah.
and description, and then going viral on Hacker News or something, getting 1,000 in an hour.
But also, I mean, I think one of the reasons Pydantic is successful is it's not. I said there are some other libraries in the space, and sure there are, but it is nowhere near as competitive a space as, say, databases, right? Because everyone knows if you build a good open source database, there are so many companies who've then had commercial success from that. And so it's a really tough market to break through in, because the threshold of confidence you need to use a database is very high. There's lots of great competition. Data validation, one of the characteristics is no one had put as much time into it as we had at getting it right. And Astral's another example of that, right? That they went and took linting initially, where sure there were some other libraries in Python, but there weren't funded startups who were like going as hard as they could to make it, to work on that stuff at all. And they went and made an amazing developer experience in that, and then it went on to formatting, et cetera, et cetera. But like, I think they've done an amazing job from a technical point of view, but whether by happenstance or deliberate choice, they chose a market where there was an enormous opportunity to do better, because there just weren't that many people competing in it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you've got an advantage in that there aren't loads of people trying to compete with Pydantic in that sense, like startups. But I guess the challenge is like, if you do build like a database project that becomes really popular, it's very obvious your path to kind of build a VC-backed startup.
Yeah.
Whereas for you, I think there was a lot more consideration in the direction that you take.
Right. And there is not an obvious, or at least a compelling to us, Pydantic as a service.
Yeah.
In a way that there's an obvious and compelling Sentry as a service or MongoDB as a service that like just works, and no one has to think that hard about why you would want to use the hosted version. There are some things that are close to Pydantic as a service. We talked in our like roadmap article last year about building a schema catalog, some way of like looking at all of your Pydantic schemas, how they change over time, detecting incompatibilities between them, etc., etc. But like, I had kind of 2 rules starting a business. Well, 3 rules, one of which I'm prepared to break. First is recurring revenue, just for my own like sanity. Having, by default, all the people who paid me last month are going to pay me this month is so nice. 2, be my own customer. I required that I would use the thing. Even if there was some enormous market in building something else someone else wanted, I just wasn't interested, because I've run a company where you have to ask someone else whether you've built the right thing, and it's annoying. And then thirdly, lots of small customers rather than a few big customers. But that one, I'd give up if we got the right big customer. I don't really care. But the first 2, I think, are really important.
Yeah. And so how did you kind of land on Logfire?
Well, I mean, pretty much. I mean, in no small part from that exact rule. Yeah. I had bought logfire.dev as a domain name in like 2019, 2018, something like that, because I was and I had been frustrated with logging for since I really started writing code seriously. It seemed so weird that that logs were not nested at all, that you just had this like linear list of things which you could filter by like what the logger's called or what message is there, but like it just seemed so inferior compared to the programming languages that were producing the logs. And the reason for that is it's very easy to collect standard out and standard error and make a logging application from that. But if you are prepared to go to the next level and integrate how you collect that data from your application, you get, nested logging, which is really tracing. And that's why and OpenTelemetry is an enormous opportunity to disrupt observability and do it better. I was talking to Ben Siegelman, who was at, what were they called? Lightstep. He started Open Tracing, which merged with another project to become OpenTelemetry, and worked on OpenTelemetry quite a lot. And he said one of the reasons they did that was back in, it wasn't that long ago, 2015, If you wanted to go and build an observability company, you put he said 70% of your effort into building the SDK, into building the application, the library that you integrated with your application to collect the data. And that was an enormous barrier to entry where Datadog had one of them for every language. What's kind of crazy is that since then, the OpenTelemetries and Splunks and everyone else, the big observability players, have really got on board with OpenTelemetry and, support it and integrate with it. And so, it's great of them. It's very kind of them to basically build this mechanism through which we can compete with them. But I'd love at some point to hear from them what their rationale is. I have my theories, but it's definitely interesting.
As to why they supported
why they're so keen to support OpenTelemetry when yes, it has some advantages for them. Now it exists. I get it. Now it exists. If you are a large company, you basically say, we must be instrumenting with OpenTelemetry so that we're not locked into any single provider.
Yeah.
And so once that's the case, Datadog have to be able to answer, yes, we do OpenTelemetry, otherwise they'll miss customers. But why in 2018 or whatever, they were promoting this way of disrupting the market, who knows? But it's very kind of them, so thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so I guess the obvious question you probably answered a million times at this point, but it's what is the link between Logfire and Pydantic?
And it is the criticism question that everyone has, from investors to engineers to everyone. I mean, I can do the version of what the link is. The link is the same obsession with developer experience, the same by the developer, for developers, etc., etc. We have a Pydantic integration, which means you can instrument your Pydantic validations and see the percentages that pass and which fail, etc. But really, I'm not claiming there's that strong a correlation. I built the thing I wanted to go and build, and it is for exactly the same people who are using Pydantic. So I think that the commercial argument is strong in that regard, in that the 350,000 people that come to our documentation every month are incredibly valuable in us promoting Logfire. But also, it was the thing we wanted to go and build. And I think that has an enormous advantage for the open source community, because there is no tension with us about whether or not to take features and put them into the commercial version or the free version. And we're not in that situation, which lots of dev tools startups get into, where your biggest competitor is your own open source.
Yeah.
Or where you're our platform's open source, so you can use it, or you can use the hosted version, so we're going to make it as hard as possible to do the hosted version. And it's this kind of open source, kind of veneer open source, which I'm not into. I want to do full-blooded, this is MIT licensed, it's infrastructural software that anyone can go and really use.
Yeah.
And then we're going to have a closed source platform that's going to make us money, that's going to allow us to invest back in the open source, but we're not going to pretend that one is the other.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I was thinking a lot about it before the show and stuff, and how I was kind of rationalizing what investors, because you've raised from some of the best. I mean, Sequoia is obviously great, and I think you got Series A really fast.
Yeah.
And to me it was almost, and correct me, this is my feeling, was it's you've proven that you can build a really good developer tool.
Yeah.
So it's almost your second time, successful dev tools founder. It's if you were backing someone that already built a really good dev tool in terms of...
Right. I mean, I think look, honestly, I would say Sequoia would agree to this. I raised at first time founder valuations, but much more easily than most first time founders. I didn't get to raise at those crazy valuations that second time founders get, and that's fair. I haven't gone and built and sold a successful company, but I've definitely got more to support the idea that I might be good at building things developers want than someone who's been a software developer inside than other people. So yeah, and look, I mean, there is actual value in Pydantic's documentation as an example. So I said we have 350,000 people going through documentation each month. If you look at what it costs on Google Ads to get people to come to your site for an observability search term, it's somewhere between $10 and $150 per click. So I think right now Sentry are advertising at somewhere around $150 a click for Django logging, because everyone who's building with Django nowadays is doing it in production, is doing it for business. No, it's not the hobby framework anymore. And so if you get that click, that person is very likely to convert into a paying customer. But even if you don't take the $150 a click, you take the $10 lower end of what a click is worth. And if you consider, and this is the like questionable bit, that a visit to Pydantic's documentation is as valuable as a Google Ads click, then you get to whatever, like $7 million, or well, $3.5 million if you call it $10 a click of like equivalent marketing value from that documentation.
Yeah.
Now, you can call bullshit on that by an order of magnitude, and it's still like very valuable it's very worthwhile for us to invest in Pydantic. And I think arguably that visit is more valuable because that person is much better time on site, much better brand recognition, much better like trust in Pydantic than if you just happen to like accidentally click on an ad on Google.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I feel like the brand part is probably more valuable than the clicks as well. In that, like, if you're just a new observability startup, probably hard to get anyone to care about you.
So we had this crazy time at PyCon US last year. We had a booth in the middle of the conference. We were not sure it's called Pydantic, the company, so it had Pydantic, the banner, but it was talking about Logfire everywhere. We were not talking to anyone about the open source library, and yet our booth was surrounded by people coming and talking to us all week. And there was the Datadog and the Elk booths around the corner. And I've got a picture somewhere of like the Pydantic booth with literally a crowd around it, and like one guy walking past the Elk booth without looking. And that is a like $12 billion public company, and Datadog are a $40 billion public company. And yet in Python, more people have heard of and want to talk to Pydantic than to those two combined.
Yeah, it makes 100% sense. And I guess observability is there's not that many proven business models in dev tools, I feel like.
I mean, I think Sequoia said that basically it's databases and observability. They are the two like places where people have made a lot of money in the past.
Yeah. And so it's a really, it makes sense to me, why they believe in you, and it's very exciting.
It's really cool. It's amazing to work with such a talented team of people and like be able to go and build something like Logfire that I've been like dreaming of for years. And I had some slight feeling I was going to try and build it myself at some point, and it was going to have to be incredibly pared back for me to, go and do it, to be able to work with, 15 or so people and actually go and build that platform has been a like amazing, somewhat like hair-raising experience at times, but really exciting.
Yeah. How has it differed to building Pydantic?
Well, so Pydantic, I did almost all of it on my own for like years. If there was a problem, the only person who was ever going to go and fix it was me. And that, there were nice bits of that. I could go and rethink things. There was the time to rewrite something if I wanted to. I got my own way all the time because there was no one else to really argue with. Now in a company of like highly opinionated expert engineers, I don't get my own way all the time, but also we've moved much, much more quickly and built something, one of the it's not a tough bit of one of the considerations of building something like observability is no one wants an observability platform in beta. So it was kind of weird that anyone used us in beta, but some people were kind enough to, but no one wants a half-baked observability platform. We're not moving into a like greenfield market where we're the only thing available, right? We're competing with established companies, and it needs to be complete to be usable. And so it doesn't work to build a like compelling demo and expect people to pay for that. The compelling demo, sure, it makes us feel good, but you actually need it to be fully functional before people will adopt it and pay for it. And so that requires a team to go and do all the complex stuff. Yeah, and you've been hiring a lot from. So we haven't been hiring a lot this year. So we were 10 when we did our Series A in the summer, and we're about to be 15. So not like by any means like crazy growth, but we're hiring a bit, hiring more in Rust because we've been building this database. So we went through a slightly weird journey in the database. So being an observability company is really being a time series database, but just with one schema is effectively how I would think about it. And so we started off building with ClickHouse because everyone said ClickHouse is the default, and ClickHouse is the obvious thing to use. Great. So we use ClickHouse. And then quite quickly, we realized that allowing end users to write SQL against their data directly was an amazing way of giving people phenomenal power in how they could search, but without having to have some horrific UI for like query builder And this like cognitive burden of like, now I need to go and learn a new syntax for putting together queries. And another kicker is that LLMs are great at writing SQL. So we can have like natural language search, which is basically ask the LLM to write SQL. Problem is ClickHouse's flavor of SQL stinks. It doesn't do that. You can't subtract 2 date times to get an interval, which when you're doing spans where all of them are intervals is like very problematic. And a bunch of other, even if you do use the date sub function and subtract 2 date times to get an interval, ClickHouse, until I complained about it a lot, thought that 2 nanoseconds was longer than 1 second because they just ignored the units on all interval comparison, which was mad. So we quickly realized that ClickHouse's SQL wasn't going to work. We then went to Timescale DB, which is a Postgres extension and quite a successful startup, and thought that was going to be great because it's just Postgres. So of course we can optimize it and make it fast, and it has lovely, nice Postgres SQL that everyone understands how to write. Problem was that, again, to allow users to write SQL, we had to have row-level permissions. To have row-level permissions, you basically have to turn off all of the features that make timescale fast. So we ended up with this like lovely, simple SQL, but very slow database. And then we discovered, in like scrabbling around trying to work out how to solve this, Data Fusion, which is a relatively recent Rust project, part of the Apache Foundation, which is basically an analytical database from scratch built on Arrow. And we've been using that since May. We actually only fully adopted, switched over from Timescale to what we call Fusion Fire, our database, like 3 weeks ago. But that's awesome. And that is like, I think that gives us the foundations to go and build like a database that works for the next 5 years for us.
That's awesome.
But the other like subtle point, which I think is quite interesting, is that everyone understands that the architecture that you want from a modern database. You want data at rest in object storage like S3, and then you in a format like Parquet or some binary format like that, and then you want to be able to go query that data from nodes nearby with some kind of caching. Basically, the data structure that Snowflake invented or at least pioneered. And both ClickHouse and Timescale have that, but in both cases, that is proprietary, and that's what you get if you use their cloud version. So although they're both open source databases, you basically get a choice between the ideal architecture and paying them masses of money to host your data, or the non-ideal architecture of stuff on SSD and some weird, horrid backup schedule and self-hosted. Whereas Data Fusion, because it's a properly open source database without a company behind it, the modern architecture of store your data in object store and query it is actually possible. And because it's Rust and it's so extensible, you can go and customize it however you want.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess that's one of the challenges of open source startups.
So I think one of the I remember talking to Bogomil, an investor from Sequoia, early on, and his take was basically, I think there were 2 ways we could have done what we did. Basically, go and use a hosted database like ClickHouse, build your thing as fast as possible, get adoption, and accept you're gonna like hemorrhage like margin when you get to scale because you're using some other company, and you can solve that problem down the line. Or you go and you build a database, and you're a database company for a year, and then once you've got your database right, you can go and get the rest of your application right, and you've got this beautiful architecture, but it'll take longer to get there. We've done, depending on how you look at it, the worst of both worlds. And as in we spent a lot of time using a hosted database, and then we've actually gone and built our own. And, we might have done it differently if we had started again, but I think we're now in a really good place.
Yeah.
And actually the thing we didn't realize when we were using ClickHouse and Timescale was we were able to innovate on the rest of the application and the SDK and all that other nice stuff because we had something, even if it wasn't going to last forever, that allowed us to get building the application.
Yeah, and then once you knew how you wanted it.
Yeah,
then...
and we knew a lot more about what we were going to go and build when we went and built Fusion Fire. And one of the things that's interesting about us as a team is we are not a bunch of database experts or observability experts. We're not like a team from inside Datadog who are like, we know what the future's going to be. We know exactly what we're going to go and build. We're going to go and build that thing. We're a bunch of originally Python developers, like users of the end application, who then had to figure out how to build the database. That means we're slower on getting the database right, but it means we have a much better understanding of what the developer wants than if we were a team who had all worked deep inside Datadog working on databases for the last 10 years.
Yeah. Yeah. The empathy is there.
Whereas if you're steeped in observability for years and have never written Python because you're, building a database, how like the empathy is much harder in a way to bring along.
Yeah, totally makes sense. I think we're coming towards the end, Samuel. So where can people learn more about Logfire?
Well, anywhere, I mean, relatively easily by Googling it, but pydantic.dev, and on Twitter and LinkedIn, but Twitter in particular, I'm relatively active on there talking about Logfire.
Yeah, and in London as well.
Yeah, I'm actually. Well, I mean, it doesn't help because it's a podcast. I'm doing another meetup this evening for Rust and Python, but like I'm going to relatively a lot of conferences on Python in particular. So yeah, if you're at a Python conference, there's a good chance you'll meet me there.
Yeah. Okay. Amazing.